18 years ago, an 11-year-old girl in Myers, California, disappeared while walking to her school bus stop just a few dozen meters from her house. She was abducted right in front of her stepfather, leaving her family devastated and the entire South Lake Tahoe community in shock. Law enforcement searched everywhere but found no reliable clues leading to the kidnapper, while the perpetrator, a sex offender on federal parole for kidnapping and rape, kept JC hidden in his backyard. He was never discovered despite his parole officer checking his house 60 times over the following years. However, throughout all those years, JC's mother never gave up hope that her daughter was still alive somewhere. She had no idea that JC had been living just 120 miles away from her for the entire 18 years. Then one day in 2009, 2 campus officers at UC Berkeley saw what 60 official checks had missed, and what they discovered shocked everyone involved in a way no one could have imagined. Before we dive deeper into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you like videos like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. In the summer of 1991, America was filled with the triumphant atmosphere following the Gulf War with troops returning home. Nirvana had just released Nevermind, and family living room TVs were showing images of the Soviet Union's collapse. The year the Cold War officially ended, Americans felt safer than ever. In Myers, California, a community of about 5,000 people, located at 6,200 feet in the Sierra Nevada mountains, 5 miles southwest of South Lake Tahoe, where ponderosa pine forests covered the hillsides and neighbors knew each other by name, children rode bikes freely. The Probin family lived in that quiet neighborhood. Terry Probin was JC's mother, and Carl Probin was her stepfather. JC Lee Dugard, 11 years old, was a child who grew up in that community. Blonde hair, bright smile, remembered by friends and neighbors as a cheerful, innocent girl who loved to laugh. On the morning of June 10, 1991, near the end of the school year, a morning when children were happier because summer was approaching, Carl Probin dropped JC off at the school bus stop, just a few dozen meters from their front door. Carl let JC out at the stop and returned to the yard to continue his morning chores. A few minutes later, a gray sedan pulled up next to JC. Philip Garrido, 40 years old, a resident of Antioch, California, 190 miles to the west, got out of the car and used a stun gun on the 11-year-old girl standing at the bus stop, then pushed her into the vehicle. Nancy Garrido was behind the wheel. The whole thing happened in just a few seconds. Carl Probin, still in his yard, saw the gray car stop, the man get out, and his daughter being pushed into the car before he could fully understand what was happening. He jumped on his bike and chased after it, but the car disappeared before he could get close. Carl stood there staring at the empty space where the car had vanished, then ran back inside to call 911. Several other witnesses saw parts of the abduction, but no one got a license plate, and no one had enough details to turn what they saw into a usable lead. The El Dorado County Sheriff's Office, the state of California, and the FBI immediately launched an investigation. The search for JC Dugard began on June 10, 1991, and quickly became one of the largest searches in El Dorado County history. Thousands of volunteers from across the South Lake Tahoe area, search dogs, helicopters, and the FBI's Sacramento field office all joined in. Thousands of tips and sightings poured in from all over California and Nevada. Every report was followed up, every lead was checked, and none of them led to JC. Carl Probin provided a description of the gray sedan and the man who used the stun gun, but there was no license plate and no specific identifying features that could narrow down suspects in a state with millions of gray cars. The investigation focused on the South Lake Tahoe area and neighboring Nevada, but it never extended to the Bay Area, never reached Contra Costa County or the city of Antioch in the East Bay, 190 miles west of South Lake Tahoe, where Philip Garrido lived and where JC was being held. The case stalled in the first few weeks and grew colder over the years. While the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office and the FBI searched for JC in South Lake Tahoe, Philip Craig Garrido was living quietly in Antioch. A registered sex offender on federal parole for kidnapping and rape since 1976, whose criminal record in the American justice system was far thicker than any suspect the South Lake Tahoe investigators were pursuing. In 1976, Garrido had kidnapped Catherine Calloway Hall in Nevada, tied her up and held her in a shed, sexually assaulting her for hours, before being arrested and sentenced to 50 years in federal prison plus a life sentence in state court. It was a sentence designed to keep him away from society forever. But he was released after just 11 years in 1988, only 3 years before he kidnapped J.C. Dugard. During his parole, Victim Hall proactively contacted his parole agent to warn that Garrido was continuing dangerous behavior and needed closer supervision. The system had been warned by the person who knew best how dangerous Garrido was, and the system ignored that warning. The investigation into J.C.'s kidnapping never pointed to Garrido, not because no one connected a sex offender with a history of kidnapping living in Antioch to the gray car at the bus stop in Myers, 190 miles apart, but because the investigation never looked in the right direction. J.C. Lee Dugard, the 11-year-old girl who had been standing at the school bus stop in Myers, California that June morning, was taken to 1554 Walnut Avenue, Antioch, California, a suburban home in the East Bay. Neighbors saw a family living in the front house and had no reason to think any further. But behind that house, hidden by dense trees, a high fence, and tarps set up to block any view from outside, was a compound consisting of multiple tents and sheds that Philip Garrido had built and expanded over time. About 900 square feet of hidden space where he kept J.C. completely isolated from the outside world. In the early years of her captivity, J.C. lived in nearly total isolation. No leaving the compound, no contact with anyone except Philip and Nancy Garrido, no full electricity or running water, no school, and no medical care. The 11-year-old girl who had just been taken from her mother, her stepfather, and the Myers community where she grew up, was placed into a tiny world that Garrido completely controlled. J.C. was repeatedly raped by Philip Garrido, beginning from the moment she was kidnapped at age 11. This continued throughout her many years in captivity, while the parole system continued to record him as compliant with his conditions. In 1994, when J.C. was 14 years old, she gave birth to her first daughter, Philip Garrido's child, born inside the backyard compound, with no doctor, no hospital, and no medical support for the 14-year-old mother or the newborn. In 1997, when J.C. was 17, she gave birth to her second daughter under similar conditions. The two girls grew up in the backyard compound. No school, no birth certificates, no legal records confirming their existence in the outside world. Garrido told anyone who asked that they were his granddaughters. The birth of her first child completely changed J.C.'s life. She was no longer just thinking about herself, but about a child who needed her. It gave her a reason to keep living and also prevented her from taking any desperate actions. Philip Garrido did not keep J.C. through force alone. He built a complex and thorough system of psychological control over 18 years, combining complete isolation, total economic dependence, and fanatical religion. Garrido saw himself as a prophet with a special religious mission entrusted by God, creating a closed worldview inside the compound where J.C. and her two daughters lived as if it were the only reality they knew. J.C. later wrote in her memoir, A Stolen Life, about the complex psychological process she went through during those years, about learning how to survive and protect her two daughters in a situation where there were no other choices, and about why escaping was not as simple as outsiders imagined. While J.C. and her two daughters lived in the backyard compound at 1554 Walnut Avenue, and Philip Garrido continued building more tents and sheds to expand the prison area, the federal parole system was following its standard procedures. In the 10 years from 1999 to 2009, Philip Garrido's parole officers conducted 60 checks at his Walnut Avenue home. They came to the house, knocked on the door, talked to Garrido in the front, noted in their files that the parolee was complying with conditions, and left. 60 times in 10 years. And in all 60 of those visits, not a single parole officer went into the backyard to check the compound that Garrido had built and continued expanding over the years right behind the front house, despite a full property check being a basic requirement when supervising a sex offender on parole, despite Garrido having a history of kidnapping and holding victims, and despite his record being more than enough for any parole officer to understand that a superficial check at the front door was not sufficient. J.C. and her two daughters lived just a few meters away from those parole officers, separated by only a fence and some coverings. But law enforcement chose not to step into the backyard of the man they were responsible for monitoring to protect the community. In 2006, When JC had already been held for 15 years and her 2 daughters were growing up in the compound, a neighbor of Garrido reported to local Antioch police that people were living in tents in Garrido's backyard and that children's voices were coming from the covered area. This was information from someone living close enough to see and hear it, the kind of information law enforcement is trained to take seriously. Antioch police went to 1554 Walnut Avenue. They talked to Garrido in front of the house. They still did not go into the backyard. Again, they left and filed a report that there were no issues at the address. JC, her 2 daughters, and 15 years of evidence of captivity were right behind the gate that the officers stood in front of before turning around and leaving. In 2008, the parole agency conducted its own investigation into Garrido after receiving information about his strange behavior. Investigators went to 1554 Walnut Avenue, questioned him about his activities, and once again no one checked the backyard. The compound remained undiscovered. JC and her 2 daughters remained unseen. 1 year later, 2 campus officers at UC Berkeley would discover what dozens of parole officers and local police had failed to find in 18 years, not with a special warrant, not with advanced technology, but with something none of the previous checks had used: basic human intuition when looking at a situation and realizing something was wrong. On August 24, 2009, Philip Garrido came to the UC Berkeley campus in Berkeley, California, along with 2 teenage girls, his biological daughters with JC Dugard, to request permission to hold a religious event for his group called God's Desire. JC was not present at UC Berkeley that day. She was still being held in Antioch. The first person to receive him was Lisa Campbell, manager of the UCPD events office, who was responsible for issuing permits for events on campus. Campbell immediately sensed something was wrong. Garrido's fanatical and strange demeanor, the way he talked about his religious mission like someone unstable, and the 2 girls with him who appeared sullen and submissive. Campbell did not ask directly, but scheduled a follow-up meeting for the next afternoon and immediately reported to Officer Allie Jacobs of the UC Berkeley Police Department. Jacobs ran a background check on Garrido through dispatch and discovered he was a registered sex offender on federal parole for kidnapping and rape since 1976. Red flags went up immediately, a registered sex offender appearing on a university campus with 2 girls he claimed were his daughters, while his parole officer had no record showing he had children. On August 25, Jacobs and Campbell met Garrido for a second time in Campbell's office, keeping things normal and not letting him know they were investigating, with the goal of preventing him from fleeing before parole could act. He opened his bag and pulled out a self-published book about schizophrenia. After that meeting, Jacobs contacted parole officer Edward Santos Jr. directly, informing him about the existence of the 2 girls, Garrido's unusual behavior, and everything the 2 had observed over the 2 days. Santos recognized this as serious new information not in Garrido's file, and immediately summoned him to the parole office in Concord, requiring him to bring everyone with him. On August 26, 2009, Garrido arrived at the Concord parole office with Nancy Garrido, the 2 teenage girls, and a young woman he introduced as Alyssa, telling investigators she was his niece. Investigators separated each person for questioning. During the interrogation, Garrido eventually confessed that he had kidnapped and raped JC Dugard in 1991. The young woman sitting in the interrogation room, who had lived for 18 years under the name Alyssa in the tent compound behind Garrido's house in Antioch, confirmed her real identity. The 11-year-old girl who had stood waiting for the school bus in Myers, California on the morning of June 10, 1991, the one whose stepfather Carl Probin had jumped on his bike to chase the kidnapper's car but couldn't catch it, was now a 29-year-old woman sitting in the Concord parole office after 18 years in captivity, speaking her real name for the first time to authorities. On the night of August 26, 2009, JC Dugard and her 2 daughters were taken by authorities to a safe location, far from the house in Antioch, far from the tent compound that had been their entire world for 18 years. The FBI arranged a phone call between JC and her mother, Terry Probin, who was in Southern California at the time, the first time the 2 had heard each other's voices in 18 years, 2 months, and 16 days. On the morning of August 27th, Terry flew to Northern California and reunited in person with her daughter and the 2 granddaughters she had never known existed. Aunt Tina Dugard, who was present at the reunion, described it to the press. The smile on my sister's face was as wide as the ocean. Her oldest daughter was finally home. We laughed, we cried, we enjoyed each other's presence. JC remembered all of us, and the painful detail the whole family only learned after the reunion. Throughout those 18 years, JC had been held in Antioch, California, just under 200 miles from her home in South Lake Tahoe. While Terry Probyn searched for her daughter across California and Nevada and prayed that JC was alive somewhere, JC had been living less than a 2-hour drive away the entire time. Philip and Nancy Garrido were arrested on August 26, 2009, at the Concord Parole Office after Philip confessed to his parole officer. The initial list of charges was long: kidnapping, false imprisonment, multiple counts of rape including rape in concert with kidnapping, lewd acts with a minor under 14, and many other charges related to the 18-year crime spree. Both initially pleaded not guilty. The legal proceedings dragged on for nearly 2 years, with multiple hearings, delays, and increasing pressure from the El Dorado County District Attorney's Office to resolve the case without putting JC and her 2 daughters on the witness stand in court. In April 2011, nearly 2 years after their arrest, Philip Garrido pleaded guilty to 1 count of kidnapping and 13 counts of sexual assault, including 6 counts of rape and 7 counts of lewd acts. Nancy Garrido pleaded guilty to 1 count of kidnapping and 1 count of forcible rape, along with California's 1-strike law for rape. This agreement was reached after prosecutors agreed to drop some charges against Nancy Garrido if Philip pleaded guilty to nearly the entire indictment. Both waived their right to appeal as part of the deal. The plea deal was designed in part to spare JC and her daughters from having to testify in court. JC released a statement immediately after both pleaded guilty. "I am relieved that Philip and Nancy Garrido have finally admitted their guilt and confessed to the crimes they committed against me and my family." On June 2011, the sentencing hearing took place at El Dorado County Superior Court in Placerville, California. JC was not present in the courtroom. She wrote in her statement, "I choose not to be here today because I refuse to waste 1 more second of my life in your presence. Everything you did to me was wrong, and I hope one day you realize that. I hated every single second of every single day for 18 years. You stole my life and the life of my family." She also wrote about Nancy Garrido, "There is no God in this universe who accepts what you did. I hope both of you have as many sleepless nights as I have had." JC's statement was read aloud in the courtroom by her mother, Terry Probyn, the woman who had lost her daughter 18 years earlier and now stood in court reading the words her daughter had written. Judge Douglas C. Phimister called Philip Garrido the poster child for a sex offender and sentenced Philip Garrido to 431 years to life in prison and Nancy Garrido to 36 years to life. Nancy Garrido received the maximum sentence possible under the criminal laws in effect in 1991 when the crimes were committed. Philip Garrido, 60 years old at the time of sentencing, would not be eligible for parole for many decades. The 431-year sentence ensured he would die in a California prison. After the sentences were handed down, the remaining question was not about the 2 Garridos, but about the system that had allowed it to happen. Philip Garrido was a registered sex offender on federal parole for kidnapping and rape since 1976, when he kidnapped JC in 1991. Meaning the parole system knew exactly who he was and what he was capable of, and still failed to stop him. In the following 18 years, dozens of investigators came to his house to check parole conditions, and none of them entered the hidden compound behind the house where JC was being held with her 2 daughters. A neighbor reported suspicious activity at the Garrido house to police in 2006, with no meaningful action taken. Investigators came to the house in 2008, still no check of the compound. JC sued the state of California over those systemic failures, and California settled the lawsuit for $20 million, the largest settlement in the state's history for parole system failures, and an acknowledgement that what happened to JC Dugard over those 18 years was not only the crime of Philip and Nancy Garrido, but also a systemic failure by those tasked with preventing exactly that. In the years after her rescue, she not only survived but recovered in a way her former therapist described to the press as living remarkably well. Someone proud of what she has accomplished in the years since leaving the backyard compound in Antioch. In 2011, JC published A Stolen Life, a memoir recounting her 18 years in captivity. The book became a bestseller and was widely regarded as one of the most honest and courageous survivor memoirs ever written, not because it dwelled on horrific details, but because it told the truth about the psychology of someone living in unimaginable circumstances, a truth that only someone who lived through it could tell accurately. JC founded the JAC Foundation, an organization supporting families and victims of abduction, with a special focus on helping families reintegrate and recover from traumas that ordinary medical and legal systems are not designed to fully handle. JC turned the 18 years that were taken from her into something that could help others, a choice no one had the right to demand of her and no one could make for her, but one she chose to make. The JC Dugard case leaves 3 lessons that anyone concerned with child safety and the integrity of the justice system needs to know. The first lesson is about the decision to release Garrido after 11 years and not listening to the victim's warning. Philip Garrido was sentenced to 50 years in federal prison in 1976 for kidnapping and raping Catherine Hall, released after 11 years. And when victim Hall warned his parole agent that Garrido was continuing dangerous behavior, the agent noted in the file that electronic monitoring would be too complicated based on the victim's hysteria. 3 years later, Garrido kidnapped JC. The parole system and courts need to take the risk of reoffending by sex offenders far more seriously before release, and must listen to victims instead of dismissing their warnings as hysteria. The second lesson is about the 60 parole checks, where no one went into the backyard. This was not the failure of any single individual, but a systemic flaw. Parole check procedures for sex offenders with a history of kidnapping and holding victims must require a full property inspection, not just a conversation at the front door. The $20 million California paid JC is an acknowledgement that this was a systemic error, not money that can compensate for 18 years, but a legal admission that the system failed in a way that could have been prevented. The third lesson is about officers Ally Jacobs and Lisa Campbell, the 2 UC Berkeley campus officers who had no special warrant, no DNA, and no forensic technology. They only had the intuition that something was wrong when they looked at Garrido and the 2 young girls with him, and they acted on that intuition instead of letting the man walk away like dozens of parole officers and police had done in the previous 18 years. If you see something wrong, a child who looks afraid, an adult exerting excessive control over those around them, a situation where your intuition says something is not normal, report it. You don't need to be 100% sure, just report it and let the authorities check. If you've watched this far, leave a comment and let us know where you're watching from, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next videos.